Great. So everybody, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We do have a Q&A function, and we can pick up questions towards the end, or our colleagues and myself may well pick up those points directly as we go along. So I think we are around about 2 o'clock now. We still have a few more to join. But I think for everybody's time this afternoon, we can sort of get cracking and people can sort of pick up. So welcome everybody to this presentation on product circularity tool for the fashion clothing sector. My name is Martin Charter, and I have colleagues Lillian and Trevor. Maybe just briefly introduce yourselves.
Would you like to go first, Trevor, and then I'll follow?
Okay, Trevor Davis, former IBM Distinguished Engineer, very much involved in sustainability with big brands and the creative industries, and the developer of the tool that you'll be seeing.
Thank you. So Lillian Sanchez Moreno, I'm working at the Center for Sustainable Design. I have a background in industrial design and working across various projects within the realm of sustainability.
Okay, great. So you'll hear more from Trevor and Lillian a little bit later, but I'll just briefly introduce the tool and some of the sort of perhaps background issues that may start to make the tool potentially useful. So we give a little bit of a background, as mentioned, to circular economy and in the sector. We'll then introduce the tool and the tool development process and have a demonstration of the tool, and then we'll get into some Q&A and discussion towards the end. So the Centre for Sustainable Design's activities started in 1995, and we've been involved in many sectors, but perhaps about 5, 6, 7 years ago, we started to look at the fashion clothing sector, and we held one of our Sustainable Innovation conferences in the area that proved to be get a significant amount of interest. And as a result of that, a book emerged. And one of the chapters that I picked up myself with Lillian was to look at the whole policy area around fashion and clothing. And to our surprise and constant pinching of our legs, we were surprised to find that largely the sector had been self-policing in terms of policy developments, particularly focused more at the design side of the life cycle. But that, as many on your call will know, that is changing now significantly, particularly with a whole raft of new legislative developments in Brussels. And that legislation is sort of being targeted at different parts of the life cycle, from the product side, the sale side, and the use side. And I'll articulate that in just right now. The whole process for the Commission, started in terms of its broadening of its interests outside of automotive, energy-related products, so electronics, packaging, around 2015, when the first Circular Economy Action Plan was published. And at that stage, the Commission started to sort of growing interest about broadening its sort of eco-design sectorial interest. And that was further reinforced in the Circular Economy Action Plan 3-5 years later, that really made it very clear that textiles and clothing was coming in the crosshairs of the Commission's thinking in terms of policy development, and particularly highlighting fast fashion as something that they weren't too, they saw a lot of environmental challenges related to it. So in a sense, that's the framework from the European side that's really started to bring in more specific aspects. What we saw just very recently on the 18th of July is the publication of the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation that really starts that process of starting to highlight the broadening into different sectors. And as I mentioned there, textiles is within the Commission's focus. Another area that relates to this is so-called digital product passports. And again, it's an area where the Commission has really significant, for some time now, highlights an interest in doing something, particularly in terms of transparency of, if you like, data and information flows through value chains. But at this stage, it's not identified specifically what it means by digital product passports. And there are over 100 publicly funded projects in digital product passports, each of whom seem to be claiming they have the methodology. But we need to wait for the Commission. We know that the textiles and fashion sector is following this very closely. There is also amendments going on to the Waste Framework Directive that focus more on the end of life and recycling elements, where separate collection of textiles is coming in. We've also recently had the publication of the Green Claims Directive that again is tightening up on how and what one can claim in terms of product environmental performance. And we know from various analyses that fashion and clothing hasn't necessarily got the greatest track record sometimes on some of the green claims that are being made. So it's been called out, in a variety of reports and sources. So again, it's an area where the sector will, needs to be careful. We also have maybe a little bit of an indicator, again, like the Green Claims Directive, coming from DG Consumer and DG Justice, that we've recently had published the Right to Repair Directive. This is mainly initially focused on white goods and electrical items, but perhaps where it's giving consumers more, if you like, power to request things like spare parts. Although this is not specifically targeted at the textiles and clothing sector, it may be, again, starts to highlight the sort of direction that Commission is going in terms of its overall thinking. And lastly, there was been the publication of the EU strategy on circular and sustainable and circular strategy textiles that really sets out a number of initiatives in terms of broader strategic directions. Behind the scenes, but not specifically focused on the textiles, clothing and fashion sector, we have a raft of new standardization that's emerged in circularity from the first circular economy standard published back in 2017 from the UK. Again, the reason I'm mentioning this, for those who are really looking at these issues, these could be useful resources for you in thinking about some of the issues. They're not sector specific at the moment. They're broad-based, covering all products, all sectors. But again, it's the indication of, from the first side policy, on the second side standards. We also recently, going back into 2018, we had an ISO technical committee set up on circular economy, and the first 3 standards have been published within that particular technical committee. Again, broad-based, terms and definitions, business models and measurement. And again, might be useful resources to consider if your organization is considering circularity. But these standards are much more at an organizational level and a business and process level, less at the product level. And I will leave you to fill in the details when I say that they are all published, but they are immediately moving into a revision process. So they are far from perfect, but as one of the chairs mentioned, when we had ISO 14000 and ISO 9000 published, they probably weren't perfect in the beginning, but it perhaps sets the scene for a 10 or 20-year process of new standardization activity. There are other standards in development, but I won't go into that. Separately now to the ISO process, we've also now got a European circular economy process starting up with 4 new standards in the early stages of development, and by the end of the year, we will know which of those standards activity is going to, officially start. I won't go into the details on that right now. Again, broad-based, not sector specific to this sector, but again, what useful to be aware is from the 2015 Circular Economy Action Plan, the Commission set a brief to SEN, European Standards Body, to develop a whole series of suite of standards related to what they termed materials efficiency. But you can read brackets product circularity. So this was around remanufacturing, reuse, repair, etc. These are again initially, related to the so-called Eco-Design Directive that focused on energy-related products. But now the Commission is, as part of its broadening interest, is looking to broaden these standards into covering all products, all sectors. And again, a standard to note there, is Working Group 8 on circular design, that again initially started on, energy-related products, but its brief now has been changed to cover all products, all sectors. So by the end of Q4 this year, there will be the first European standard around circular design. And again, just as a reinforcement here, we do have, and I'm talking with my hat as chairing the Circular Economy Committee for British Standards Institute, there's a whole raft of standards starting to emerge with a sort of prefix circular on it. So there's circular furniture, there's circular construction products, there's circular fishing gear. We have seen the first working group and technical committee related to circular textiles, and that's an area that we're starting to look at within BSI. One point again to consider in going forward is that there are all these standards in place, from ISO and IEC, focused on if you like, the doing of eco-design, the broader approach to integrating environmental considerations into design and development, but also how to integrate eco-design into environmental management systems. So certainly my view is circular design is a sort of reinforcement of that. One needs to be aware of, the trade-offs and the other issues with energy and water, for example. So in looking at circular design, one should be cognizant of the other standards, perhaps, that are already out there and being used. So again, I guess part of this is what's being recognised by policymakers now. And one of the reasons why have we started to sort of look at this particular area. We have projects that are evolving in this space, and we're particularly interested in recreational sports clothing areas. So I'll now pass across to Lillian, and both Lillian and Trevor will tell me when they want me to move to next slides.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, so before we begin with the tool development methodology, if we go to the next slide, please. I will offer a brief overview of the background that underpinned the early stage development of the product circularity for fashion, textiles and clothing tool. So this project stems from a European Commission Horizon 2020 project entitled Orienting. It was developed across 3 years and recently completed in April. The main aim of Orienting project was to develop a life cycle sustainability assessment methodology to offer practical approach that considers the environmental, the social and the economic impacts in an integrated way, as well as including material criticality and product circularity to facilitate decision making towards the circular economy. Next slide, please. As the methodology development progressed, challenges started to emerge in relation to the practical use of existing circularity indicators and metrics by industry, which led CFSD to undertake in-depth qualitative research to identify further and assessing circularity at a product level. So with this in mind, we conducted 21 in-depth interviews with organizations that ranged from SMEs to multinationals and across various industry sectors. And the interviews focused on scoping key sustainability considerations as well as product circularity at a design and development level. The main findings from these interviews were that there is a need to promote a multi-level approach within product circularity assessments. Methodology and tool development should offer guidance for adapting product circularity measurements and indicators that meet specific industry requirements. And there is also a need for these assessments and methodologies to address how to effectively bring various stakeholders together and highlight where to locate the relevant information. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, as part of the project, we developed an entry-level product circularity guidance for users to begin their circularity journey. And this guidance consisted of 5 steps and 3 forms to be completed by relevant stakeholders, with the overall aim to enable organizations to cross-communicate across the various different business functions to gain a common understanding of product circularity, identify the most feasible product circularity strategies for a specific product, and to begin to identify and collect the data required to conduct a more quantitative assessment. However, as mentioned previously, the interviews also highlighted that even though there are a variety of existing product circularity indicators and metrics, they're not industry specific, and therefore fail to address the product-specific value chains and requirements. So with this in mind, we decided to focus on developing this tool further, specifically for the fashion, clothing, and textile industry. Next slide, please. So the product circularity fashion tool focuses primarily on supporting design and development to produce garments that are aligned to circular economy principles. So we will now go on to demonstrate the tool, well, the methodology behind the tool development, and this will be followed by a tool demonstration. So I will pass the slides on to Trevor.
Right, well, just a quick background. Some of you may know that the Centre for Sustainable Design has a very successful tool out there for sustainability maturity in the high-tech bit of the creative industries known as Createch. There are over 500 users of the tool now, 30 countries around the world. And so when we started thinking about how do we put a tool together for this particular area of product circularity, that was the natural starting point. We had something that worked, and at the heart of it was the idea that you should allow people to benchmark themselves against a set of criteria that says, you know, are you at the beginning of your journey, 0, or are you at a basic level of maturity, an intermediate level of maturity, or are you one of the very few that's advanced? But one of the difficulties in this particular area is that we had to develop an algorithm. And the algorithm to calculate a score for maturity could not be developed in the same way as we did for Createch. In the Createch area, we had a very large survey. We had a lot of quantitative data from that. But here, what we had instead was access to industry experts. And so what we did is we turned to a wisdom of the crowds approach known as paired comparison analysis. And very simply, this means you take a number of potential areas which you think are relevant to product circularity and fashion, and you ask people to look at each area and to compare it to every other area and make a judgment based on their expertise and knowledge of the industry as to whether it's much more important, a little bit more important, less important, or much less important. And as you go through these comparisons, what you start to build up is a quantitative picture or semi-quantitative picture of the rank order of importance of the different criteria. And you can see the topics or criteria on the right-hand side of this slide. Now, you might say, well, maybe there are more criteria or topics we should have asked, but there is a challenge with this particular approach, which you can see at the bottom left of the slide, which is that when you get to large number of items, then the number of comparisons each expert has to make becomes very large, and it becomes a rather tedious process for them. So we decided in the end that we would limit it to 15, and those then have made their way into the algorithm in the tool. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of what it looks like when you're doing these paired comparison analyses. On the left-hand side is the comparison you're asking people to make. So do you think the infrastructure for recovery is more or less important than limiting production of new garments? And essentially what you end up with is a heat map of all of these different comparisons, where things which are kind of blue are kind of less important and the things that are red are more important. I think it was that way around. Maybe it was the other way around. But you get the idea. You've got a visual picture of where people think the importance is in these comparisons. Next slide, please. So how does that then turn into the tool? What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully this will come through okay. I think I do have the share button. So I'm just going to turn off Martin for a moment. And I'm going to share my Safari window, which you should be all able to see now. So this is the tool that we have today. You come to a landing page, which is pc4fashiontest.org, and you get a little bit of text. You get a description of the life cycle that we're using. And then what you have are a number of choices available to you. So for instance, if you want a quick refresher on terminology, there's a link you can click. If instead you'd like to read through the different parts of the life cycle, you can click on these different blocks here, and I'll do that for you in a moment. You can go straight to doing an assessment, or if you're really ambitious, you can download our product circularity assessment toolkit. So let me just focus for a moment on the questionnaire that people would fill in, and also some of the content. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on one of these blocks. I'm going to pick the design block. They all basically follow the same approach. So what you get is an introduction, in this case, to designing for circularity. It contains a number of areas that we think are important for people to consider. And then I'm going to scroll through a little bit quickly, because you can see there's a reasonable amount of material here. You've got a section then you've then got a section at the bottom where there are links through to relevant policies and standards. So Martin was talking about the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. Here we have it. Here's the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation. So there are links here you can click, or you can just read the small summaries. So for each of the stages of the life cycle, there is a same amount of material. We've tried to make it very accessible. We've tried to make it quite short, but to the point. Of course, one of the things that people should be doing if they come to the tool is using the benchmarking. So what I'm going to do is click on this button that says ready. And what comes up now are the 15 topic areas that you saw me discussing on the PowerPoint shortly before. And what you do very simply is you go through, you read each of these areas. I'm just going to scroll through just for today and tick a few of these radio buttons. And when I've gone through all of them, then what I will be able to do is calculate a score, or more importantly, the computer will calculate the score. And it says based on completing the questionnaire with the answers I gave, my score is about 65%, so 6.5 out of 10. And that's considered to be intermediate maturity based on our benchmarking scheme. So what you get then is a little bit of guidance based on each of your individual question answers. I won't go into any more detail than just showing you a couple here. So for instance, on question 1, I said I partially disagreed on the ability of the business to reduce post-consumer waste. It comes up with a couple of immediate suggestions that you should consider. And you can go through all of the different questions in that way. If you click on the next button, there's then guidance on how you start thinking about your journey. In particular, thinking where to begin. Gives you a very simple plan, do, check, act framework, which I'm sure many of you will have seen in different contexts. And then depending on whether you're 0 or basic, intermediate or advanced, again, we give some guidance on where to start. So for instance, on this 0 one, we have a link to a video, which really takes into account that somebody at this level may not know very much, and just gives some very basic guidance on circular economy for fashion. Now, the final part of the tool, before I hand back to Martin and Lillian, is actually the product circularity assessment. So what Lillian has done is to take the orienting process that was developed as part of the Horizon 2020 project and really shrink it down so that it's much more manageable for somebody to run by themselves without any expert input. And so what happens on this page is that you get a description of each of the phases you might want to consider if you're going to do a starter project around product circularity. And then at the bottom, there are a series of links to forms, which are all in the Microsoft Office format, which allow you to capture data to do your product circularity assessment. I'll just click on one of these for now, the goal and scope form, which I will probably need to open up in another window because the way these things work. Where'd it go? I'm now demonstrating I cannot multitask. There we go. So I'm just going to share for a second. And then I will reshare. And here is the goals and scope for. So a simple introduction on how to use it, why you should use it, a little bit of definition, link to ISO 14044. And then a bit more description on the flow that you might want to consider in terms of determining the scope of your assessment. And again, I won't go through the whole form. They're all there for you to kind of browse. So that's a summary of the tool. There's a questionnaire there. There's information there. There are downloadable forms. The tool is going to be launched in its beta form on Friday of this week. It's actually up and running now. You can actually go to that URL and play with it if you wish. You can't break anything and it all works. We're just making a few little tweaks in a couple of areas for cosmetic reasons. So thank you, and back to Lillian and Martin.
Thank you, Trevor. Yeah, so just to summarize, up until now, the idea is that the users would have encountered suggestions on how to help structure their thinking around product circularity and built up their knowledge and strategies for improvement that is relevant to their particular circumstances. But then with the downloadable tools that Trevor just mentioned very briefly, the idea is that this would be recommended to take the information guidance further and potentially for an intermediate and above level. So while you're still within the 0 to basic maturity level, the idea is to continue to revise and make improvements within the main so yeah, and then I will pass it back to Martin, and we can go through the Q&A.
Okay, great, but I needed to unmute myself. So thanks both. So again, just sort of contextualizing a little bit before we open up for questions. And if you have specific questions, please put that in the Q&A, but I think we're of a sufficient size that we can, as long as people are don't all ask a question at the same time, I think you can sort of raise your hand and ask a question, and we can ask, people can ask questions direct. So again, what we've identified again is that this sort of raft of new policy development and standardization activity that is starting and set to grow around the sector has not been there in the past. A lot of the focus of that new policy and standardization is particularly for clothing and textiles as sort of material-based products, with extended supply chains, is that a lot of the thinking has not had a lot of the thinking in terms of eco-design or product circularity has really emerged out of almost innovation for companies wanting to innovate. There hasn't been these external drivers through policy and legislation and standards, but that is clearly now set to change. And again, from our perspective of this, many, particularly MSMEs and SMEs are unlikely to have the skills and expertise in-house because they've never had to in the past. So indeed, I was on a meeting with British Standards Institute of a lady who's looking at sustainability roles in the fashion and clothing sector and has recently reviewed job descriptions for sustainability managers, and in none of those job descriptions she found circularity, which was interesting. I thought that was quite interesting. So it may be that a number of these things that we're talking about are really going to be new, and then how you adapt those regulatory drivers into requirements that it's going to impact on design and development is going to be a new set of challenges for a number of companies. So hopefully this is where we're positioning the tool. Again, from all of our collective experience, we've tried to design it around the reality of a lot of companies. And we know, and we have quite a strong feeling that a lot of the reality of a lot of companies is they're going to have, but at quite an early stages of understanding of these issues. So I'll stop there and open up for questions or comments. Again, is there anything you've heard that we think we've got severely wrong? Is there things that, do you think there's sufficient tools out there that are tackling, the issues? So really, anybody want to sort of kick off with a question? Or maybe not. Do we have any questions in the Q&A or the chat? I think chat, we have introductions and very good, I saw. So does anybody want to sort of kick off the party? Anybody want to sort of just make some general comments maybe about, do you all feel very, very well prepared for all the regulation and standards that are coming down the line? I know there are some people on the line who are in Asia, joined from Asia, that that are big manufacturers and suppliers. Is your government providing sufficient information about things like preparing the industries in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or India or whoever is on the call? Are they providing you with sufficient information and training to prepare, the businesses? So we've got sort of 29 people still on the call. There must be somebody who wants to. Have you got a specific question? Are fossil fuel-based materials seen as a major area requiring change in fashion? What I was surprised to see is there weren't at a national level specific, net zero drivers for fashion and clothing sector, if I remember rightly. I think there is a UNFCCC protocol about climate change and net zero across the fashion sector, but this is very much a sort of code of conduct. And like many things in the sector, there are a lot of codes of conduct. There are a lot of initiatives, but it's very difficult to see to what extent they're actually implemented or correct, or are there for awareness rather than driving change. So certainly, there are issues to do with energy use of materials and manufacturing that one may increasingly be have requests down through the supply chain. But I don't know if Trevor or Lillian, you wanted to add any thoughts or observations on the matter?
No, well, I think the specific question was around, the kind of synthetics like, polyester, nylon, etc. And some of the kind of regulation that's out there policy that's out there is really aimed at trying to get those back into secondary supply chains much more effectively, so that they either get upcycled or they get returned as much as possible back to fiber and then kind of reused. I think it's a slightly confused market at the moment because there's the kind of infrastructure for kind of waste management in a lot of parts of the world is not particularly well set up for doing any of this at a particular scale. And also, some of the different recycling processes, materials, particularly the ones that use chemical recycling, there is a kind of a downside that we're only really just trying to grapple with there. So I think the answer I would give is that you need to look inside the kind of recycling policy to see how those things are being handled. And then there's a general point really, which is, that, we shouldn't forget that, some of the natural materials, as we like to think of them, like cotton, bring huge kind of environmental and social impacts as well. So there's a kind of a bit of a balance kind of to be found in policy making.
So again, sort of now reading the question more precisely, as Trevor did very well there. Again, one needs to be, cognizant of the sort of general shift in perspective on plastics generally, and some of the challenges, particularly with landfilling of plastics, in the Atacama Desert, Ghana, microplastics going into seas. So there's a sort of whole broader meta sort of level going on with plastics that's also leading across a lot of materials sectors, but initially in packaging, to also starting to look at biomaterial experimentation, new types of biomaterials. And as Trevor highlighted there, the infrastructure, is perhaps more mature in some countries than others. And I think what we're seeing is already the sort of precursor to this, in that at a national level, there is so-called extended producer responsibility regulations now in place for fashion and clothing in France and the Netherlands. And at a national level, they are emerging or slated in other countries. So really, within those, within that regulatory regime, it will mean, many of these issues will also come more specifically into sort of regulatory focus, and questions like, building recycling infrastructure, as Trevor was mentioning there, keeping materials within countries. Places like Sweden are looking to retain materials within countries rather than letting those materials and products bleed outside the countries. So I think there's, stemming from that question, there are many issues. So any other questions? Yes, good progress with your toolkit. Just wanted to highlight that as a fossil fuel synthetics are, I can't read the bottom of there.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
So go ahead,
No,
Trevor.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's very interesting you should say that, Greg. I mean, so for those of you who are not reading the chat, it says just fossil fuel synthetics are around 60 to 69% of current materials. It could be suggested that circularity here is possibly unachievable. Interestingly, when we were going through that paired comparison analysis with various experts in the industry, you could feel that kind of tension, because one of the areas that Lillian and I were testing with people was, are big brands, big manufacturers prepared to work on reducing overall demand and production, because that's why we've got this very high level of those synthetics. And you could see that some people clearly thought that was desirable, and it might be aspirational, but it should be there. And then others were kind of in the camp of saying, well, actually, I can't ever see the industry as it's structured today actually ever getting. I don't think there's a neat answer to this question, to be honest. I mean, I think, all I can say is that in doing some of the background research, for the tool with Lillian and Martin, is people know the issue. They really do know the issue. 10 years ago, I don't generally within the fashion and textile world, there were always going to be some people who were kind of part of the environmental or sustainability movement who were fully aware of what was going on. But I would say now you'd be hard pressed to find, a company that isn't at least aware and debating that issue.
I think, so building on Trevor's comments there, I think there's an issue that we've seen, with a new raft of startups that are really building circularity and sustainability, or trying to build circularity and sustainability very much into the DNA of their businesses, and are really trying to be, trying to progress, but realizing they're on a journey. There aren't perfect answers to this. There isn't absolutely there isn't perfect information on that. That was another thing that we recognized in doing the book, that really there is often a lack of objective data in this area. We so there is drivers from entrepreneurs to build this and develop more circular products, but what we'd also started to see is inadvertent greenwashing, people not necessarily understanding all the issues and making green claims that were perhaps incorrect or erroneous because they just didn't know enough about the issues and the information. And again, that may not be in an attempt to metaphorically pull a wool over people's eyes, but it may be just a lack of knowledge. Another reason to look at things like the tool. But it was very clear that there was a sort of some different levels of activity going on amongst some companies. where, you know, the copywriter's pen was rather free, and it wasn't necessarily good, based on good strong data. And that aligned very much to the challenges of getting good, strong data back through the value chain. Sometimes suppliers not knowing why questions are being asked or having the context to answer them, or sometimes, how does one put it, incorrect information being provided. So particularly for this sector, because for a significant proportion of the UK and Europe, the supply chains are outside UK or Europe, you know, how one is going to communicate, particularly on the design side, these issues through the supply chain and to suppliers in a variety of different countries is going to be a challenge. I mean, I looked at something similar back in the 2000s on the electronics sector, and we ended up having to translate the tool into Chinese and Thailand and into Thai to actually put it into the language of a lot of the suppliers who may not speak English or read English. So again, that's something that needs to be considered. Again, we've got on the other side of it, where a lot of companies are selling into the chain, whether it's business to business or it's to retailers. A lot of the manufacturers, and this is cross-sector, they don't really necessarily have a clear understanding of how customers use products and if they are repairing products. So that whole use phase issue, and particularly on repair, it's about extending the life of the product. Those aspects of product circularity are not well understood. So again, you know, that is going to be more of an issue around how you get access to good data to improve the performance of the products. So again, I still see there are 26 people on the line. If you don't want to, you can speak if you wish. I'll ask a question directly, or if you want to, you know, put a question in the Q&A, the chat, please do.
Interesting to hear some of the perspectives from kind of Africa and Southeast Asia.
Or we see circularity as an essential part of the way forward with the regenerative, and sorry, my email is chopping, my chat is chopping stuff off. I mean, okay, transition responsible design as other required to get praise. May I invite your review? Okay. So essentially, we've got other work going on within CFSD, a PhD who's looking at the whole area of regenerative design in a, let's say, a slightly more systematic manner than has been used to date. The regenerative is used in a very broad systems level, but what that actually means in terms of real products is less well developed. In this sector, there's clearly a lot of work that's been done on regenerative agriculture, and is obviously very important in terms of the natural fiber side. But when, you know, one gets into really what does regenerative mean in terms of product design, much less work has been done. So that is something we're also sort of tapping into. So could you know, grow you at the end of life, could you grow new clothes metaphorically, or could you have self-healing clothes? Or so it's a lot of interesting questions, and I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things in your paper as well. We need a lot more at a product level coming through. People like Daniel Weil, who's part of you know, is a sort of holistic thinker, has a lot of systems level thinking that's very useful, but we're particularly interested in what happens at a product level, you know, back upwards. So Were you trying to, I saw your lips moving, Trevor, but nothing came out.
I think I was chewing on a piece of licorice sneakily in the background, which is probably not the smartest thing to do on a Zoom call, because it probably means I've got black teeth. I mean, I think, again, I think I did have a quick look at the paper that Greg has written with Cheryl Campbell. And, I think there is a lot of work out there which is pointing in the right direction, in my view, as to how we move to a more kind of sustainable kind of life on this planet. And I would add into that, kind of work of economists like Kate Raworth as well. I think one of the challenges in this particular kind of sector is that you've got this real mix of international brands like Kering and LVMH, et cetera. You've then got a world of micro SMEs all over the world. You've got textile businesses, which are often kind of large national or multinationals in their own right. So the value chain here is very kind of complex. And then behind all of that, you've got all of the agriculture, which is where almost all of this starts. And the reality is there's a lot of stakeholders along that value chain that still are working out how they align with the people on either side of them to make some of this stuff happen. And I've been involved in this kind of area really since the 1970s. And I see some very smart people who are still struggling to work out how to make some of these things happen. It doesn't mean that we don't think they will happen. It's just that, it isn't as simple as here is a technical solution to a clearly defined problem. These are wicked, messy problems that we're dealing with, and it's going to need some clunky solutions to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick that question up, Trevor. But yeah, as Trevor highlighted, there's a lot of important systems level work going on. Within our work, we're very interested in particularly the focus on products and business models. So, so where there's much less work that is going on. We know that, for example, Philips and electronics has started to think what regenerative might mean for them, and that's very interesting. It's obviously outside the sector, but they're one of the key guys in starting the work on eco design back in the 1990s. So I was very interested to see where the leaders are starting the terms. But when you look at the standards, for example, I was just reviewing the circular design standard just over the weekend, wearing my BS High hat, and the standard talks about the importance in terms of regeneration of nature, in terms of the contribution of circularity in helping to regenerate nature, but it doesn't define what that means in terms of strategies for product development, for product design, etc. So there's quite a lot of a sort of disconnect with some of the high level important high level discussion going on, and how to implement it at a sort of more of a grassroots level, whether that's citizen level, product level, etc. So where we are. So this particular tool has been developed beyond our Horizon 2020 project and through UKRI funding. And what we will be doing is, as Trevor mentioned, we will be starting to promote the beta version of the tool to be used as widely as possible from the end of this week. And we encourage feedback, people who are interested to come back to us. And then we're also looking to hone the particular tool more precisely into a specific area of interest for us, which is around the sportswear sector. And we'd be very interested to hear from anybody in the sportswear sector to talk about some of the more specific issues around that sector. We're also recognize that it's a vast sector. There are many different product categories. There are many different processes, you know, from a manufacturing side, from a technical side. You know, there are issues to do with fibers, chemicals. It's a highly complex area. So that's the reason why we've decided to sort of hone in even more precisely on one vertical area. But that tool will be out there for people to use, and you know, we hope that it will provide a useful resource for people, and we would value any feedback or engagement. So we're very open to further discussion, particularly from manufacturers and suppliers in value chains, whether they're in the UK or, you know, any place in the world. So I think, unless there are any other burning questions for everybody's time, I think we've had, you know, I'd like to sort of thank my collaborators, Lillian and Trevor, in their excellent work again on this. And we're open to continue the discussion with anybody who's interested in talking to us. And thank you all very much for your attention and questions. And we look forward to further dialogue as you see fit. So thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the afternoon.